first question in Rotary's four-way test. Is it the truth? And in the spirit of Cannon's reference to iconic characters, it's the first word in Superman's catchphrase: truth, justice, and the American way. Our guest speaker today is one of the good guys, standing up for truth and against disinformation. Sharon Moshavi is the president of the International Center for Journalists, ICFJ, an NGO based in Washington, D.C., enabling a worldwide network of 160,000 journalists to provide trustworthy news that is essential to free and strong societies. ICFJ develops and runs some 70 programs around the world, helping journalists address the critical issues of the day, innovate to connect with communities, and build news organizations that thrive. ICFJ was founded in 1984 by journalists from the New York Times and Boston Globe with the idea of supporting fellow journalists abroad, especially those in countries with weak or non-existent free press. They believed that the role of journalism is to expose, investigate, and articulate issues of concern to average citizens, and endeavored to spread these ideals across the globe. The world looks different today, but the central role of a free press in functional democracies remain the same. While Sharon is only in her second year as president of ICFJ, she's been with the organization for over 15 years, leading new project development, innovation, and impact. She has designed programs to support newsroom transformation, create investigative networks, and mentor emerging media leaders. She also spearheaded the creation of ICFJ's research arm. Prior to ICFJ, Sharon worked as communications manager with the Knight Foundation, and for more than a decade before that, she was based in New Delhi, Jerusalem, and Tokyo, reporting from countries across Asia and the Middle East for Bloomberg, Business Week, and the New Republic, among others. The villains of disinformation around the world today have met their match. At this time, I would like to invite Sharon up to the stage with our own superhero needing no introduction, David Lewis, who will serve as moderator. Please give our distinguished panelists a warm Rotary welcome.
Disinformation is something that we apparently hear about more and more. There seems like there's a headline every day. Just a couple of examples. Yesterday's Atlanta Journal-Constitution had an article about how Brad Raffensperger, our Secretary of State, that his biggest fear about elections wasn't voter fraud, it wasn't machines, it was politicians lying about results. That was his biggest fear, none of the other things that we hear about. Washington Post had a piece today about how Twitter, under Elon Musk's new management, has relaxed its rules, which has allowed Russia and Chinese propaganda efforts and disinformation efforts to explode. And then the New York Times has an article this morning about how the guy known as the godfather of AI recently quit Google because of his fears over how the technology that he helped create threatened all of us. But let's talk about what's really important. What's the scoop on Don Lemon and Tucker Carlson and Dominion voting systems and Fox News?
Okay, well,
and how do they relate to disinformation?
They do relate, sadly, to disinformation. The Tucker Carlson leaving Fox News, obviously. Oh, am I not on?
It is. Just hold it closer. Just hold it closer.
Okay. Usually, my daughter usually complains I'm way too loud. So apparently. So what happened with Tucker Carlson leaving obviously is very directly related to the disinformation ecosystem that we're living in right now. This came after the settlement with Dominion voting systems, and while it was not directly related to the settlement, Dominion has said this was not a requirement of the settlement. What happened, what Fox discovered, was that lies are costly, and they basically made the calculation. Again, there's all kinds of reasons for why Tucker might have been let go. But the Dominion voting settlement very clearly was evidence that there is a line too far in in libel suits, in libel law across the US, you have to have the intent for malice, right? That is why most libel suits do not go forward, because it's an quote unquote honest mistake. And what was exposed was that the hosts of the Fox, including Tucker Carlson, were saying one thing, not believing what they were putting on the air, and that exposed them to the intent and the malice charge.
All right, just a definition. What's the difference between disinformation and misinformation?
It's a great question. Disinformation is the intentional spread of false information. This is what you see coming out of state actors. Russia, China, and Iran are the biggest state perpetrators of disinformation campaigns. India and Nigeria are coming up fast. So that is often where disinformation, you can do it also, it's not just political actors, it can be folks doing it just for the money, and we can talk about that more in a minute. Misinformation is something that I would venture to say everyone in this room has participated in, myself included. Misinformation is the unintentional spread of false information. Often it comes from disinformation campaigns that are spreading, and you see something and share it, not realizing it. But that is the unintentional act of spreading false information.
Okay, big picture, how worried should we be about the threat of disinformation?
Extremely. I mean, disinformation is not a new phenomenon. We've had propaganda as long as human beings have been alive. What has changed is the ability to amplify and spread it at lightning speed. And AI, in particular generative AI, the ability to create content, pictures, stories, etc., speeds that up infinitely. And where disinformation, I think, it affects every single aspect of our lives. It affects us as citizens. You need good information to make decisions. It affects your life as a citizen, right? We've all seen the impacts of having disinformation around elections. And businesses. I mean, this is a room full of business folks. You guys rely on quality information. You want to know about what's happening with trade with China. You want to know about your brand, brand sensitivity, for example, or brand, your reputation. You see all kinds of disinformation spreading about, Amazon. It can be any company. Eli Lilly, I think it was last year, there was a hoax where someone purporting to be Eli Lilly said, oh, free insulin for everybody. It did not go down well for Eli Lilly, needless to say. So the impacts are just literally in every aspect of your life.
We have a huge problem here in the U.S., but talk about, ICFJ does so much international work. Talk about how disinformation is impacting countries overseas, and give some examples of the kinds of things that you're seeing.
Absolutely. But before I do that, I want to one thing I think is important to recognize is that disinformation is probably the biggest global industry. Great import-export business. It is going in and it is coming out. So obviously into the US, what we're seeing is massive, massive disinformation from places like Russia, as I said, China, Iran, all kinds of places. And then we see us exporting it out. Our disinformation gets exported out. In some cases, it gets translated into Spanish, and then it comes back into the US again and goes into our Spanish language communities. I just want to give a shout out to my colleague Laura Zammer. That's one of the projects that we're supporting, is helping fight disinformation in Spanish language communities here in the US. To your point about what we're seeing elsewhere, is what happens often is, and a New York Times reporter gave this analogy, so I will give credit where credit is due. She said that often what you're seeing with disinformation campaigns is it's the equivalent of working in sort of less developed countries that don't operate in English, because things not in English go under the radar. The social media organizations do a much less thorough, you can argue if they're doing a thorough job in English, obviously, but it really does get ignored. And so a lot of things are tested in countries. Around elections, India is a great example where things are tested. Again, all parts of Latin America, we're seeing narratives start. And what happens is, as the New York Times reporter said, it's the equivalent of sort of like a car thief trying out, strategies to steal a car in a low policed neighborhood. And then, once they get really good at it, they bring it to Beverly Hills. And the developed world is, in this metaphor, Beverly Hills. And so there are no borders. There is not, oh, it's happening in this country, it's not happening here. There is a playbook, and it gets played out in literally every country in the world.
It feels like politicians, bloggers, pundits never pay a price for lying, for spreading disinformation. How do you make them pay a price?
Fox just paid a rather large, multi-billion price, and I think a lot of people are wondering if that might be a watershed moment. Is there a price with an actual dollar number attached to it? Is there a price to be paid? That is a challenge. I think what news organizations are trying to do, there's a real sense in the journalism community that we need to build trust and transparency to serve our audiences, but that also we're making the bet that, hey, that's how you make money. People will actually want to pay for trusted information. And so if you can build those lines of trust, how do you sort of make that a business itself? But to your point, yes, this is the problem. You can actually make a buck being dishonest, and there are active people aside from political actors. You have troll farms who don't care about politics, but they can make money doing it. There was, if you all remember the Canadian trucker protest, there were troll farms basically setting up false GoFundMe campaigns to raise money for the truckers. It did not go to the truckers. So there are incentives built into our systems to make money. But again, we need to counter it with efforts to build trust and transparency.
Your average parent out there, I mean, my kids are all out of the home and on their own now, but for someone with young kids, I mean, I think it must be terrifying to think of the kind of information that their kids, like all of us, are being exposed to. Is there a role for education about information that needs to happen or is happening?
There is a huge role there, and it's incredibly important. There are a lot of media literacy efforts, and I would say as a Rotary Club, if I can make a pitch, and supporting these kinds of efforts in school are really important, and it's not about politics, it's about who are your sources, checking your sources. Is this reliable information? But I would also argue as media literacy is not enough for our kids, we all need it too. And how do you inject it into community efforts to make communities more media literate? Journalists are trying to do it. There are a lot of efforts to build better connection and connective tissue between local news outlets and communities, which I think is incredibly important to building that literacy. The other thing I want to add to that is my fear, less than people believing the wrong thing and our kids being exposed to the wrong information, is that we are developing a generation of people who don't believe anything. And that is a lot of what disinformation narratives, especially political ones, try to do. The Russians are stupendous at it. They don't care necessarily what you believe. They'll throw at 8, 10 different narratives on the same thing so that you throw up your hands and say, well, I'm not going to believe anything. I don't know what to believe. And I think when you look at the younger generation, I got an 18-year-old myself who knows damn well to check her sources, but still, we are raising a generation of people, of kids who don't believe in anything. And I think that is more dangerous than anything.
Talk more about AI specifically and the kinds of ways it's being used to generate disinformation.
So AI is being used to generate a lot of things. There is, before I get to the horribleness of AI, which we could spend hours and hours talking about, there are benefits to it. And, in journalism, for example, the hope is that we see ways that it can speed up the process so that you have more time to really do the deep digging, investigating, and not do the grunt work. So there are positives to AI. So I just want to lay that out there before I go down the rabbit hole of an Orwellian chaos that we are about to see. The generative AI is incredibly scary. The area that I think a lot of people are particularly worried about is visual generative AI. The ability to create, I think we've all seen the videos that just came out about Biden and Kamala Harris. There was the Pope wearing a puffer jacket a few months ago, my personal favorite. So you see, and visual information is really important because that's what plays on our emotions more than anything. And that's generally what disinformation does really, really well, is it plays on our emotions. And we, as human beings, we're much more responsive to emotion than to reason. So the challenges are going to be enormous. From the media perspective, journalists are desperately trying to figure out, how do we do this? Again, it's not that it's different than what the combating disinformation efforts that have been happening, but now it's going to, again, be at scale. It's just going to literally in 3 seconds. So that is a big fear. There are efforts by companies like Adobe and others, and there's a consortium of news outlets to create sort of verification indicators. So you see when something, you know when something is real and something is not. So it's going to require a whole new set of muscles that we have to develop as a society that we haven't remotely developed.
We all live to a certain degree in our own echo chambers. And, in that environment, how do you reach people who are in, whether it's, QAnon or God knows, there's a million examples. How do you reach people who are trapped inside an echo chamber of disinformation?
Couple of answers to that. The first is, and Lara and I were talking about this last night, to go try to reach the extremes on any side, I don't think is the point. I think it's a fool's errand to some extent, but there is a giant middle who live in their echo chambers, and we believe, and we all have our biases and confirmed biases, and we respond to those. So that, I think, there's a large mushy middle, which I think we need to be approaching. That said, the best purveyors of information, or the people we trust the most, are people we know and individuals. So how do you get inside communities? How do you, there are always influencers, there are community groups, there are activists, all kinds of people, businesses. How do you use these nodes of community? And that's one thing, these are some of the projects that we've been trying to support, including actually one in Nigeria, which is getting together news organizations with community leaders. It's with a lawyer, with a doctor, with all kinds of folks, and then using them as sort of nodes. And then veterans, for example, is another group we've been working with. And how do you then work with them on media literacy, in effect, and then have them sort of share out? Again, it's not specific information, it's behaviors. We're trying to change behaviors. Do you, as opposed to, I'm going to believe this, I'm not going to believe that. But all of our behaviors need to basically change in how we approach information.
What are some other examples of what ICFJ specifically is doing with its disinformation program?
So one of the things we're doing is the other side of this, which is building trust. As I think probably many of us in the room know, trust in most institutions is down, and journalists and politicians are at the top or the bottom, depending on which way you want to count. So one of the things that we're really actively doing is seeding efforts to build trust, looking for new experiments, new ways of doing journalism. And so we're supporting different efforts. A couple of examples of those, an Indian American is building a sort of media literacy tool for the non-resident Indian community in the US and abroad, which is huge. And they send a lot of information back to India on WhatsApp. And so again, how do you, they're sort of these nodes of influence, how do you tap them in order to create channels of better information? Another thing we're doing is supporting, as I said, Lara's effort, which is great. So this is an effort called Facchequiado, and this is a great example of taking lessons learned from outside the US. Lara's from Argentina, has seen all of this play out in Argentina, and is bringing that expertise here. And she's working with 44 different Spanish language outlets around the US, because Hispanic communities are twice as likely to be sort of victims, if you will, of disinformation than other communities for a host of reasons, including the fact that they use social networks more, the fact that they, again, that non-English language information goes under the radar and is ignored by the platforms. So that we think is incredibly important, especially in the run-up to elections. That ability, because as we've seen, misinformation in different communities in the U.S. has a real potential to have a very negative impact. We think it had an impact on the way Florida voted, for example. The Miami community, for example, there was a lot of disinformation on Spanish language radio. So these are the kinds of things that we're working on, both globally and here in the U.S.
The genie is out of the bottle, whether it's AI, social media, politicians, governments, as you were saying, Russia, China, Iran attacking us. It's out of the bottle, but what can we do?
I would approach that again as individuals and as citizens if So as individuals, as I said before, I think safe to say every single person in this room has spread misinformation. If we ever have gone online or listened to media or shared anything, we have it. Again, not intentionally. So we all need to be better news consumers. Check your sources. It sounds like eat your spinach, but it actually matters and it makes a difference, as my 18-year-old daughter has told me. So she has stopped her, you have two sources. So look at what you're doing. Don't share things that you actually haven't read, I think is another thing. And again, I think many of us are guilty of that. The Rotary Club and as an organization committed to service and committed to community, I think, again, this needs to be an issue that is addressed in a nonpartisan way. We all are suffering from disinformation. Again, our ability to be businesses, to be citizens, to raise our children. And so looking for ways to support media literacy efforts, to support media, to support local media in particular, which is the most trusted form of news for most people. So I think we need to approach this both as what is the civic engagement piece and then what is our individual responsibility.
I think we should open up to questions. Folks, let's answer the questions you want to have answered. Stephanie.
I watched the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and I thought Roy Wood did a really good job with his monologue. In addition to being funny, he made an important statement about how all news started as a local story. That really hit with me because I love local news, and more we're seeing less of it. So I actually have two questions for you. First of all, what can be done, what is being done to help continue to cultivate and save local news? And also, I'm just curious, were you able to snag a ticket to the dinner, and what was that like?
I'll answer the first. No, I was not, sadly, but a number of our partners were there, and Politico actually put a sign about us on their tables and raised some money for us. So that was better than being there. So I can answer that one first. The thing about local news is a very simple answer: pay for it. News is it's not a commodity. It's if you want it, it's valued. You have to pay for it. One of one of the areas we focus on is media sustainability, journalism. Not that people are looking necessarily to create a profit. Most local news organizations, new ones starting, are not for profits, or if they are for a profit, it's a penny they're looking for to make. So that is, I think, the biggest thing that you can do. The other thing is get to know local journalists. I hear so much people say, oh, the media does this, the media does that. Usually people are really talking about the shout fest they saw on cable TV. That's not most journalists. That's not most journalism. And so opportunities for journalists to speak to the community, to engage in community activities, I do think is incredibly important because, like many, we've become demonized, right? And that, when you dehumanize and demonize, it's not real, they're not real people, they're not really doing their best. And most journalists are really, really doing their best.
Other questions? I had one which we can use if there are any others. So, well, first of all, thank you very much for your thoughts there. So, it boils down to value systems in a way, right? So if you want to use disinformation as a weapon, but at the core, if you can say someone's values are first, community and debate is even more important than that, they can self-correct, right? But those that truly aren't going to have those values, and I think you touched on it a little bit earlier, but how do you reconcile those two things, and how do you really attack that one where that's their value, is disinformation?
It's hard. As I said before, people who are so far gone, they're not intellectually honest, so you can't have an intellectually honest debate of differing ideas. And you don't want to get into a position, I do think this is where the social media companies have honestly struggled. I mean, in some ways it's simply a business motive, but in other ways it is they don't want to shut down free speech. And that line between disinformation and free speech, right, is really, really hard sometimes. But I think, to your point, you can have that debate. I mean, you want to be able to debate somebody on the merits. And shutting it down doesn't always work, but this is, again, what journalists try to do. What we're trying to do is promote a healthy information ecosystem. So if you want to combat disinformation, you have to have the good stuff out there to battle against it. So to your point about, what can we do to support local news? If you don't have quality information, reliable information, then disinformation will be the loudest voice in the room. So you really have to say, okay, we have to basically combat it, not by necessarily going after it directly, which is also important, but also, responding to it with really quality information on the other side.
Well, great point. I know you touched on that. I mean, the quality of the institutions at the end of the day can fill that otherwise void or vacuum that disinformation fills. Any other questions here? We'll do right here, and then we can come back over here. So go ahead, David.
Everyone's looking for, they want to see the facts. We want to see the facts interpreted the way they want to see their facts interpreted. So the whole idea of the fact of what is right-wing news versus left-wing news, you just want news that's accurate. In England, you have a dozen newspapers stretching the entire spectrum of news, and people then gravitate to the news they have. So I think the problem is I think people have lost faith in other countries, have lost faith in the media, because oftentimes the media isn't necessarily an independent media. Oftentimes they're a state-run media. So journalism gets kind of lumped into a lot of different buckets. Some are propagandists and some are independent. How do you kind of divvy up the world so that there's a better understanding of what an independent free press is?
It's a great question, and you're right. It is a huge problem. But again, the internet sort of exacerbated, right? Your brand gets lost. You don't know who you're reading, what you're watching necessarily. I think that this is why I personally think, and why my organization is supporting a lot of it, efforts to create more transparency around the news process, I think are vital, absolutely vital. People don't understand what goes into making the journalistic sausage, if you will. One of the projects that we've supported is with Vox Media, for example, and they're building what's called a transparency layer. So you know more about the reporter. You know why they reported the story, how they reported the story, because even just deciding what to report, nobody really understands. And I think those kinds of things are really, really vital. I remember when I was a working reporter, invariably you get the question, what was it really like? And if you have to ask that question, then you did a lousy job telling your story. So I do think that building of trust and transparency needs to be front and center in the journalistic process.
I know I saw Billy's hand, and I think I saw one other too. So Billy, and then maybe Dennis, did you have your hand up? Okay.
I think of our organization, and it's our own individual employees' responsibility to protect corporate assets from phishing scams or bad actors or whatever it is. And you mentioned also, and when we're told that, we're told of the cost of cybersecurity, for example. And you mentioned the cost of local journalism is valuable and we should pay for it. Do you, or has your organization quantified or put a cost on disinformation and thought about how to raise the cost that it impacts us and our community in a figure sort of way?
That's interesting. My next project, clearly, not a dollar figure, but there are very specific costs. It's a really interesting question. I will have to think about that. But where there is a very documented cost is in civic engagement. When you don't have local news, when local news goes away, you have fewer people voting. You have fewer people showing up at your local council meeting. You have less civic engagement. That's been well documented. And I think that ultimately has a fundamental cost in our societies. There is a gender cost. Women journalists in particular are harassed online at volumes that are just extraordinary, much more than men. And so what you're finding a lot is women moving out of the space. So you have, we want more diversity in media, we want to represent our groups, but if groups feel like this is a dangerous place to be, you're going to see sort of moving out from space. I mean, all of these things ultimately will have a financial cost. I mean, Eli Lilly's stock price went down, right? That's a financial cost. So it's hard to, I think it's hard to come up with a single number because, again, this is just in so many facets of our life that we don't even fully see it and realize it. But I think if you looked at any aspect of your business or your life, you can find a specific cost.
Dennis?
How do you see disinformation playing out in the 2024 elections?
My crystal ball. So it's already being called the AI election. If previous elections were the Facebook election, you are going to see it playing out writ large. The difference, I think, will be slightly is that people are more aware. All kinds of research and studies, when you ask if people, if it's a big, disinformation is a big issue, it's like 75, 80%. I mean, Americans don't agree on anything. And so that's a pretty big number. So I think the disinformation is going to come from every side, domestically, internationally. So I think, my concern is that people stay home. Is that people, again, what you end up with is this skepticism, is like, I don't know what to believe, I don't know who to vote for, I'm just not going to stay home. So I think keeping it in the limelight is incredibly important. Again, I think that's another role for journalists, is the more attention that disinformation gets and the more that we are teaching people to think about it, but not just to throw up their hands and say, forget it, but how can we make people say, hey, think about X, Y, and Z. So I think it's going to be like nothing else. Again, the generative AI is going to change this, I think, like no election. We've already seen it starting.
Zach.
Excuse me. Tell me how you think that the topic of transgenderism is either truth or disinformation or misinformation, and how it's being portrayed in the American press.
Easy one, thank you. Well, first of all, I think there is no such thing as the American press. It's not a monolith, as we've seen. There are people coming at it from all walks of life, and we increasingly do have polarized media the same way our communities and our people are polarized. I think we as a country have an inability to have informed debate about any issue at this point. We are incredibly polarized. So being able to report in a way that makes everyone happy has become absolutely impossible. And I think a lot of news organizations are struggling with that. The New York Times, if you may or may not know, has had issues from, they were attacked for their coverage of transgender issues. I've actually been listening to a podcast about J.K. Rowling, which has been interesting. So it's a minefield. I mean, this is the problem where we're in now. It is a minefield. There's no right way. There's no wrong way. And our ability, you can throw up immigration, abortion. I mean, every hot button issue. It's the one that's getting the most attention right now. But there is no monolithic way to cover it or not to cover it. It's just clearly emblematic of our inability as a country right now to have a cohesive debate about a lot of things.
I think we have time for one or two more. Margie and Clark, I saw your hand. Okay, go ahead.
So I know that you're taking the global view, but there's a lot of businesses in this room that have relations with the media or don't have a relationship with the media, including myself. I've had to learn how to deal with the media. I run 2 nonprofits and 2 for-profits. How would you encourage people in this room to engage with the media in a transparent, effective way? Because I find that when we get beyond local, we bounce off it. The national's not really interested in local stories.
It's a great point. It goes to the fact that the ecosystem is shrinking. There are fewer, there are fewer news organizations. There are fewer large news organizations. So they're getting inundated by things. I do think the local is important. I mean, I wouldn't underestimate that. A lot of national reporters as well are looking, they're looking at local media to communicate stories. There are a lot of, I would look also for folks that are working in networks. I mean, NPR is a great example. You have a local NPR station here, and most NPR stations are also connecting with NPR headquarters and national news. So I would look for those sort of avenues where your local news organization, again, outreach to them, but what networks do they have that you can tap into?
And so there was a great article I thought it was really interesting. I think Tom Johnson actually posted it on Facebook, is how I came about it. But it was about the death of the newsroom. And this idea that a physical place where people come together and they have, whether it's trust or competition or, arguments, on the floor, on the layer of cigarette butts apparently that once existed in those places, but that those places have gone, and a bit of that culture that comes with the journalists wrestling with what is truth, what do people need to hear, how are we fairly representing these concepts, seems to be being substantially altered by this physical or hybrid rather world that we've moved into. I was just curious how this hybrid world where you don't have David Rubinger or Maria Saporta walking around building personal relationships with people as they do in this room, that they then can go to and ask what's really happening in this sector, what's really happening in this issue. How is that actually impacting the vulnerability of our society to fall prey to misinformation, disinformation, and then unintentionally propagating it?
It's a great question. Newsrooms and journalism is no different than other businesses. I think probably everybody in this room is struggling with the hybrid model. We have all seen the studies that you have more productivity. If you're, working from home, you have less creativity, all of these things. So I don't think journalism is immune to that. The struggles are similar. I do agree you have a couple of things there that are, maybe unique to journalism. One is mentoring. Newsrooms are not, how shall I put this politely? They're just not organized. It's not, it is, we try, but it is made up of people who usually basically just weren't cut out for the corporate world, if I may. And there's so many business organizations have real structured leadership, programs and ways, and the news industry still struggles with that. It's like, oh, I'm tired, I don't want to be a reporter anymore, I'll be an editor. It's a bit better than that, but not always much so. So you lose mentorship, which I do think is important. So that is something, and again, a lot of newsrooms are struggling with that, and a lot of them are coming back. That is changing. I'd say too, there are flip sides where there are things that might help it. So one thing is collaboration. As news organizations have fewer resources, there's a lot more collaboration happening. And that collaboration by definition is not happening with somebody sitting down the aisle from you, down the cubicle from you. And so as we've learning to work better in a digital space, it is opening up collaboration. We saw a lot of that happening in the pandemic. News organizations much more willing to collaborate with each other because those boundaries had been broken down. So I think that is a positive thing that could potentially be coming out of this.
And Clark, I just want to say you're spreading misinformation, man. Those cigarette butts went out before the pandemic, along with the oyster shells and the chicken bones and so.
And if I could just add one thing, because I didn't tie that to misinformation and disinformation, but those collaborations I think are incredibly important to trying to combat dis and misinformation. It does take a village, and it's not just collaboration with other journalists, but with researchers, with civic organizations, having that ability because everybody's part of this whole information ecosystem. So again, as we are developed the muscles to sort of work with people who are not sitting across from us, I think that's healthy in terms of combating disinformation.
Well, Sharon, you have brought wisdom to what is one of the defining issues of our time, disinformation, and you've shown that it's complex, but you've given us a path and some ways to think about it. So Sharon, you and the ICJ are just doing an incredible work there. Let's have a round of applause and thank Sharon Moshavi for being with us.
Thanks for having me.